From the beginning of Montana's distinctive yet troubled history, the Treasure State was dominated, both economically and politically, by powerful outside interests who shipped in capital and bought control of the state. Historians tell us that as the Anaconda Company and its friends ran Montana, economic and political power flowed out into the hands of distant capitalists and corporations. Policy was determined in far-off New York City, and control of the press was rigid. Anaconda's corporate dominance in Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. For its first 75 years, Montana was a one-company state. But then big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Between 1965 and 1980, Montanans ripped off their copper collar, transforming Montana from a corporate colony into a free, modern state. The people finally controlled their own destiny. The pitched battle between the people and the established power structure was not easily won, but fired in a crucible of change. A new Montana was born. Join Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time as they shine a light on this remarkable era.
Welcome back to In the Crucible of Change. We have a very special guest today, retired District Judge Gordon Bennett, who came from northeast Montana and was a confidant and involved in the campaigns and governmental activities of both Senator Lee Metcalf and Governor Forrest Anderson. And he was involved in so many important things that we're so pleased that he was able to join us today and share some of his insights about Lee Metcalf, about Forrest Anderson, and about what they did politically and governmentally, as well as kind of his overall reflections on the political climate of Montana and what's been going on in Montana, not just during the Crucible of Change, which we're talking about in this series, but how some of that has applicability today. So Gordon, welcome to In the Crucible for Change. You know,
glad to be here.
You came from northeast Montana. You came from Scobie.
Scobie.
And recently there was a wonderful book out about northeast Montana that people find hard to believe, but it was called Red Corner. And there was some pretty radical politics that came out of North Dakota and then the northeast corner of Montana back in the time of the Depression. I think it flavors a little bit about what went on in subsequent years, and I wonder if you might dive into that a little bit before we move, too far forward.
I'd be glad to do that. The thing that we should remember is the natural upset that occurred in the 1930s, not only in the corner of Montana, but throughout the Middle West and so on. The agricultural depression.
Mm-hmm.
That gave rise to a generation of people who needed Franklin Roosevelt's admonition that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. He was talking to the people of northeastern Montana because the people of northeastern Montana in the 1930s had essentially lost hope. And people who've lost hope are very dangerous people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important to understand how bad the loss of hope was in northeastern Montana in the 1930s to understand what the politics of 1960 was all about.
Mm-hmm.
There was acute desperation. People have to understand that dryland wheat farming is a gamble. It isn't a business. It's like going to Las Vegas. And frequently the game is rigged against the players.
Mm-hmm.
That is to say, a farmer who plants wheat in the fall or in the spring he's betting that that's going to come up.
That's dry land farming.
And it's going to come up if it gets sun and if it gets moisture.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1930, there wasn't getting any moisture. And that was compounded by the fact that wheat, which is marketing at $5 or $6 a bushel today, was selling for 25 cents a bushel or lower. So if they did get a crop, it wasn't worth anything. And they couldn't get credit. They were bankrupt, but people weren't going bankrupt those days. They didn't file for bankruptcy. But you had a whole community, a very large community in northeastern Montana, of bankrupt people, and they were desperate. And you have to understand that that gave rise to my generation.
Mm-hmm.
And our generation, we're not anti-government, because we not only had the leadership that provided for hope rather than fear, but because it helped farmers with all kinds of agricultural programs that brought them back to life. That influenced my generation. It isn't influencing this generation.
Although that, you never know, might change depending on the level of desperation that the middle class has been feeling lately. I was having an interesting discussion about that actually this week with Bruce Nelson, who you know, and Bruce worked in Governor Judge's offices and with Pat Williams and with Governor Schweitzer. And Bruce heads up Farm Service Agency in Montana in the Obama administration. And he said he was on a tour of the state discussing the farm programs with the farmers of Montana, going to 40 or 50 communities and talking about it. And that point you made about, he was making the same point. He said, you know, the farmers understand that government actually can work for them. With programs today, government can work for them. He said, now, sometimes they don't think about how it might work for others, but understand how it would work for them. And so Franklin Roosevelt's being the kind of solution seen by folks who were desperate at that time, you know, Lee Metcalf came out of that, not from that corner of the state because he was from Stevensville, but he came from that period. You know, when he was elected to the legislature back in the mid-30s as a 26-year-old young lawyer, he was in the flow of the New Deal. And that colored his politics significantly too, don't you think?
Lee, there were a lot of things that Lee didn't understand and was quite vocal about not understanding it.
Mm-hmm.
One of those things was when he was the senator, when he was a United States senator, Montanans were getting $2 back from Washington for every dollar they sent by taxes.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't understand that. People, some of the people that were the most adamant anti-government people he knew were wheat farmers who were taking in $250,000 a year of various kinds of farm relief. He didn't understand why those people were so mad at him, mm-hmm. because he represented the government.
Mm-hmm. Same might apply in the wood products industry. There was a lot of stuff going on where they subsidized the wood products industries. The taking of timber was very much subsidized by the U.S. government in a big way. And yet a lot of the people in that industry thought that Lee Metcalf was the devil. Mm-hmm. And I think he kind of decided to live up to his reputation with them too, I think, some days. Now, when you know, most of us know you as an attorney, an attorney of some note, and then ultimately a district judge. But you started out as a newspaper man, didn't you?
Yep.
Tell us about that, and what was the path that took you from a newspaper person to becoming an attorney and in increased interest in the political world?
When I graduated from college with a degree in economics, which means I didn't know where I was going, I spent a winter on the East Coast and had an opportunity to read every day the New York Times, which is was a marvelous newspaper and is a marvelous newspaper today, by far the best in the world. Mm-hmm. And I kind of lived with the New York Times for about 3 or 4 months and decided I was going to be one of the world's great journalists, probably a Pulitzer Prize winner or write the great American novel or something. So I went off to the University of Missouri and got a degree in journalism and went to work for the Great Falls Tribune.
Which was an independent paper in Montana at a time when most of the major papers were owned by the Anaconda Company,
Yes,
correct?
that's right.
Yeah, okay.
A very independent paper and a very good, very sound paper. Mm-hmm. Put out by an old guy named Warden. Well, his son was putting it out when I was there, but he came from New England. Mm-hmm. And he kind of was a tell truth or die guy. Mm-hmm. And they liked it for the most part on the Great Falls Tribune when you were digging not up scandal, but something that was genuine news that they could mm-hmm. print.
So you were there, and in one of our coffee meetings we were having, it was mentioned that you had went to a Farm Labor Institute, and that kind of fired you up on some things. Tell us about that.
The Farm Labor Institute, I think, should be remembered by many Montanans as one of the yeastiest things that ever happened intellectually in Montana. Generally speaking, people had the idea that farmers used the Montgomery Ward catalog for sanitary purposes in their home in the summer, and they read the catalog all winter. Mm-hmm. That wasn't quite true. The Farm Labor Institute had farmers there that were as intellectually subtle as anybody else I've ever heard, and terribly well informed. And they worked with the labor people, and it would surprise many people how cultured many day workers are. Mm-hmm. They are today, and they were then. You know, and these were great intellectual exercises that went on for 2 days, while everybody was heard that wanted to be heard, but there weren't very many nuts in the crowd. But the talk was absolutely progressive. It's the only name I know to put on it. Mm-hmm. It was very progressive. They were looking forward, and they were people that are coming out of this generation that I was talking about. But they were people that were interested in change, progressive change, constructive change. And it was where I started thinking a little seriously about public affairs.
You know, that it's kind of a continuum in a way of when I was going to college in Minnesota, I found that the Democratic Party there was called the DFL, the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. And then as you moved through North Dakota, you had the NPL, the Nonpartisan League, which was the same coalition of farmers and workers. And that moved itself across the border into Montana, into the Red Corner, and then further west in Montana. And so you found it intellectually stimulating to sit there, and did that kind of what made you think I may want to be a lawyer rather than a writer?
No.
Was that just a happenstance?
No. What I concluded there was that there's something very important about public affairs.
Yeah.
That it affects us all, affects every one of us, children, grandchildren, and so on. It affects our daily lives and so on, what the public affairs are all about. That's what I got interested in. To put it nice way, instead of politics, I got interested in public affairs.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's right. And ultimately, when people think of too much about politics, and the result of politics is policy, and public affairs is where that gets delivered.
That's right.
So, tell us about you. Then you did decide to go to law school, though. You were urged to by was it your uncle or someone that said you ought to be a lawyer?
I had an uncle who was a professor of law in the District of Columbia. And he thought I ought to be a lawyer, and he won the argument after many years.
So then you did come back to Montana. Thank God that you did, because you've actually...
I'm not sure that's the deity that you want to go to, but anyway.
Well, you've for many of us, you've contributed so much. I am an unabashed admirer of what you've done over many years, and so many of the folks that I've dealt with over the years hold you in the highest regard for your involvement, what you bring to the table. You were, as a young attorney, there was another attorney that was elected Attorney General, and that was Forrest Anderson. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about him here, starting with the fact that Forrest had been a county attorney, he'd been a legislator, and he decided to run for the Supreme Court, and he ran in 1950 for the Supreme Court and got beat, but then learned some lessons apparently quite well, because he ran again in 1952 and he was elected to the Supreme Court by a rather large margin. But he decided he wanted to be Attorney General, and in 1956 he ran for Attorney General and was successfully elected there, the first of what were 3 terms as Attorney General. And tell us about your walking in to the office and thinking, maybe I might want to go to work for this Attorney General, and that, because that's such an amazing story to me.
Well, I just finished qualifying to be a lawyer in Colorado and in Montana, but I was a lawyer without any visible support. That is to say, I didn't have a job. I was up in the Montana legislature just as a auditor. Didn't have any funk up there. Ran into a friend of mine, and he said the Attorney General is looking for assistance, and you should go down and talk to him. So I went down and talked to the secretary, Miss Jean Handel, and she introduced me to the governor. And the first picture I ever had of Forrest Anderson was he was sitting behind his Attorney General's desk, and he was scribbling on some yellow foolscap and cussing at the foolscap. He was pretty mad and pretty upset. He was a brand new Attorney General. And one of the first things that happened to him as Attorney General is a local guy decided that it was important for him to sue all of the oil companies in the country because the price of their oil, the price of their gas was the same at every pump. And that was a monopoly, he thought. And so he was going public on requesting the Attorney General to sue all the oil companies. And Forrest Anderson, who is a born pragmatist and a very experienced person, didn't think much of the idea of the Attorney General of Montana taking on the whole oil industry, and he was trying to write it out as a press release. And that's what he was troubling himself with when I saw him first. He interrupted that thing to interview me quite formally about my qualifications as a lawyer. And I thought he was quite clear that he didn't think I was very well qualified. So we parted on that. And as I walked down the hall, Miss Handel, his secretary, caught up with me and she said, the general, she used to call him the general wants to talk to you. Well, I'd never, having been in the Army, I never turned down a general on anything. So I went back to talk to Forrest Anderson. And he said, are you one of these ink spillers? And I said, well, yes, I've worked in the news business. Yeah, well, he said, this is my problem, and he laid out his problem to me, and he said, help me out a little with this press release. So I took the whole thing and went in my office and worked out a press release in response to this demand that he sue all the oil companies. Laid it on his desk, and he read it and grumbled a little and hem and hawed a little, and he didn't say anything about the press release at all. He said, come back tomorrow morning. So I came back the next morning, and I worked for him for about 2 years.
Yeah. Well, he was a pragmatist, and he saw that he got double out of you. He got young lawyer and experienced writer at the same time.
He had a somewhat experienced journalist and a real tyro of the lawyer. Yeah. But anyway, well, we did the best we could.
So you were with Forrest for a while.
On his pragmatism, I'd like to add one thing. There came a time early on in his administration as Attorney General when the Korean bonus went into the Congress, the first Congress when I was with his office. And they passed a law which provided a bonus to everybody who'd served in Korea, a state bonus, and it was based on cigarette tax. And I think that's where they got the money, is cigarette tax. And of course, from the other side of the aisle came the objection that it was unconstitutional for the legislature to do that, to just award a particular group for doing something, so on. So there was a legal question. And Forrest said, come in my office and said, write an opinion and say this is constitutional. And I said, well, just briefly, why is it constitutional? He said, 4 members of the court are veterans, and there's a couple of others that would like to be veterans. It's constitutional. Whereupon we found it constitutional.
And assumedly it met constitutional muster at the court level as well.
Yep.
Yeah, that's an interesting story about pragmatism. That does reflect it in one straight-up episode, doesn't it? Well, we'll come back to Forrest, but let's talk about Lee Metcalf for a little bit here, because in 1966, Lee was elected in 1960 to his first term of the U.S. Senate, and he was up in 1966, and that's the first general election that is inside this period that we call the Crucible of Change, the 1965 to 1980 new progressive era of Montana. It was the first election, and it was a very dramatic election because he was running, and Lee always had a history of running pretty close races. And he was having to run against the incumbent governor who decided, wouldn't it be nice to be a senator? Tim Babcock decided to run for senator. And that had to be a big race from a national perspective, you think about it, but think about it inside Montana. A sitting governor running against an incumbent senator. That's a big ticket item. You were engaged in that race. I like to call you a campaign manager. You're always saying you don't like that term, but you were effectively, you and Brett were running that campaign for Lee as much as anyone could. Tell us a little bit about that campaign and about working for Lee in that context.
Brett was Brett England.
Yes.
I was his first assistant. His whole crew came out to help him. The most dedicated bunch of people I've ever seen. Lee was not the easiest guy in the world to work with. He had powerful instincts, preferences, demands, and so on. But his staff loved him like no other staff I ever saw any place. They would do anything for him. All I did was a little coordination work and a little scheduling work and so on. I guess somebody got the idea I was managing it. I'd like to point out that nobody ever managed either Lee Metcalf's or Forrest Anderson's campaigns, but the candidate themselves. Mm-hmm. Lee on principles, ran the campaign with an iron hand and somewhat to detail. But he left a good deal of the details, the smaller details, to all the rest of us, and we had a full hand. So I exercised my liberty in that respect on scheduling him. Mm-hmm. And one morning, Lee came in and said, "You're trying to kill me, aren't you?" And he wasn't quite satisfied with the way I'd set out his day. But anyway, it was a very workable organization. It was a hard-working organization. They didn't know anything about time. They did what was necessary and took what time there was and put everything they could into it. Mm-hmm. And both of them shared this one thing, and that is they liked to delegate things that could be delegated. And when they delegated something, they didn't want to hear any more about it. When they delegated something to you, both of them had the same principle. The reason I'm appointing you, or the reason that I'm putting you on that job, is you can do it.
Do it.
Do it. Do it. And that's what they did. Mm-hmm. And it was a tough campaign. It wasn't as vitriolic as a lot of these campaigns. There was some humor in it. Lee was fascinated with one thing he thought up all by himself, and that was he didn't believe a great many things that Babcock was saying. He didn't want him to call him a liar or anything like that. But on one speech, he'd list the things that he thought were inaccurate that Babcock was saying. And then he'd conclude with just, "That's Bab talk."
Bab talk.
Bab talk. And one of his close associates, I think who should remain anonymous, said, "Lee, that's very funny, but it's lousy politics. Cut it out." Mm-hmm. And he did. Yeah. He did it in one speech. And he was mad at everybody for about 2 days after that because nobody would let him use Bab talk.
Yeah. Well, I think he was a combative by nature.
He was a football player, you know. He injured his knee playing football. everything Lee did, he did enthusiastically.
Mm-hmm.
He's a tremendous enthusiast.
You know, when we were talking about how close the races were, that when he ran the first time for Congress in the primary, I think his victory was by 55 votes in the primary. In 1952, he won by a narrow amount, and then he beat Paul Cannon by 55 votes, and then he won by only about 1,500 votes statewide in the general election. And then he started getting some pretty good results during the latter years in the Congress, when he was in the Congress. But when he ran in 1960 against Orvin Fieri, who was a former Eastern District congressman, again in 1960, he ended up winning by only 4,000 votes on a statewide. It was a very narrow victory. So he always seemed to be right on the edge of losing, and it may or may not have had to do with the fact that he took principled stands on issues. Can you give me your take on that?
Well, I have a very strong prejudiced take on that has immediate application, I think. Today, we criticize, properly so, those congressmen and representatives and senators who put first priority on the next election. When a decision is called for, they take a hard look at what will happen the next election. They have come to do that because of the influence of money in politics. They have to do that, because if they don't do what they're supposed to do, they don't get the money for the next election, and they don't serve. And there's an old saying that goes around, you can't be much of a statesman unless you can get reelected. Mm-hmm. That's a great justification. Lee didn't quite take that position. Lee's idea was, do what's right, and hopefully you'll get 50.1% of the vote.
Which is what he often was close to.
Which is what he wound up with quite frequently. In other words, Lee that wasn't his first priority at all. He believed in getting reelected, but that had very, very little to do with what stands he took on principle on particular legislation. Had nothing whatever to do with it.
I think that's probably why his staff loved him so much, but also why so many people, I know that I always idolized Lee Metcalf, because I knew he stood for what he stood for. Mm-hmm. And it was usually for the right thing, for the average people, for the working people, for the downtrodden, for the natural wonders of Montana. He wanted to see jobs for people. He knew government had a role. In fact, is it reasonable to say that one of the quandaries for Lee was when there was a push for him to run in 1960 for the Senate, that he had a hard time coming to the conclusion, as many people say, automatically, if you're in the House, you should want to be a senator. But people say that he was pretty much on the way to being Speaker of the House. He was that respected in the House.
That's right.
And he kind of gave that up to become a senator.
That's right.
Did you ever sense any regret that he had? Because he was doing a great job as a senator.
He didn't go around complaining about being a senator, but he did say that since he was senator, he had great admiration for the founders of this country for providing 6-year terms.
He liked that.
He liked that.
He liked that, yeah.
I'd like to add to what I just said with regard to what's going on now. It would have been interesting to see how Lee reacted to the situation that we now have in Washington, and that is, on any principal piece of legislation, of course, there are two sides to it. That's the reason they have legislation. That's the reason why they have lawsuits. One side or the other is going to be unhappy when you make a decision. When Lee was there, if he made decisions that were disagreeable to some folks, he had to face the fact that they were going to be against him. But what he didn't have to face is those folks who were against him would not come against him in the next election with $7 million. That's what they're faced with today.
It is a daunting challenge for someone. In fact, we do see where it's a standard thing for a huge percentage of the time of an incumbent senator or congressman to spend maybe 60 to 70% of their time on the phone raising money instead of on the floor or in the committees legislating. That's a sad commentary, I think, on our times.
And it's aggravated, of course, by the 2010 decision of the United States Supreme Court in something called Citizens United. In Citizens United, the Supreme Court of the United States decided, without any constitutional base or precedential base, that corporations are people. The United States Supreme Court breathed life into corporations and gave them the same liberties and entitlements as people.
And money, the spending of money was free speech, and so the richer you are, apparently, the more free speech you have.
That's right.
Maybe in that case it's not free speech, is it? It's maybe paid for speech.
They implemented money
Yeah.
as the most important political thing in the whole spectrum.
Your reflections on that, because Montanans had a Montana solution to that started with the 1912 Corrupt Practices Act and continued through some changes in the 70s and then in the early 2000s. We had our solution, which was thrown out. What's your reflection on the future of that? And Montanans clearly are out of touch or disagree with the Supreme Court on this.
Well, I think the Supreme Court's already been heard on that, more or less, but the Supreme Court isn't going to reverse that at all. They're not going to reverse Citizens United. And the way that it's now rigged with another decision that has come down, Montana provision, which still is on the books, I believe, has been superseded by the federal rule. And there's going to be unlimited money influence until that's reversed. And to get back on the subject, I've wondered from time to time how Lee Metcalf would have handled that, because the influence of money is tremendous compared to what it used to be due to that decision.
Well, back to the 66 race. That was a race where Lee actually ultimately won by about 17,000 votes.
That's a landslide.
Yeah, I mean, I have it down here that he had 138,000 and Governor Babcock had 121,000. So, and that was in an off-year election. So that was a big win for Lee.
Lee was probably wondering what's going on here anyway.
Do you have any reflections on what caused that win to be that dramatic?
I don't know. We thought it was time for a change, or time for not a change.
Yeah.
I think that that generation of people that we're talking about just came to flower. Lee spoke for them more than nearly anybody except Mike Mansfield.
Well, 2 years after that, and actually it would have been quicker than that, Governor Anderson, then Attorney General for 12 years, decided to run for governor. And you were involved in that race as well, but in some of our discussions, I asked you, well, did he just suddenly decide he wanted to be governor? And you reflected upon how you thought he wanted to be governor for a long, long time. He just was picking the right time to do it. Can you tell us a little bit that some of the early discussions you had with him that gave him the idea that this is a guy that really would like to be governor? Was there some reflections about Governor Aronson and the prison, as I remember?
Well, during his first term, while I was still in the office, we had the first prison riot over in Deer Lodge. As you know, I go on about this at great length. But anyway, there came a time when nobody seemed to know what to do, particularly the warden didn't. And the prison itself was under siege, closed to outsiders. They were threatening to kill people in there. They were burning the place down. And the prison commissioners, consisting of the governor and the Attorney General and the Secretary of State, were all there because we were there to make an annual inspection. So there they all were, and Governor Anderson turned to Attorney General...
Or Governor Aronson.
Yeah, Governor Aronson turned to Attorney General Anderson and said, "Well," he had something of an accent, "Well, you're the Attorney General, you take care of this." And I think at that stage, Forrest thought, well, you know, if it's that easy to be governor, maybe I ought to be governor. I don't know that that was his thinking, but my point is that following that, the governor drove home in the middle of this riot, and Forrest Anderson got the secretary to pick up the phone to the interior of the prison and said to the first person that he was talking to, "I'd like to talk to the guy that's in charge over there." And so he got a hold of the convict that was in charge of the prison. And he talked to him for about 15, 20 minutes, just ordinary conversation, not cussing, not directing, not being Attorney General. And put down the phone and he said, "I got to go in and talk to these people." The State Highway Patrol people, Superintendent of Highway Patrol said, "No, you're not. You can't go in there." Forrest said, "Didn't you hear the governor? I'm the Attorney General." The National Guard people said, "If you go in there, we're not responsible, you know." And I think Forrest said, "That figures," and walked into the prison alone, unaccompanied. Went through the prison doors and they closed behind him, and he was in there for about a half, 3/4 of an hour and walked out. It's the bravest thing I've ever seen. But it could be at that time, Forrest was thinking, well, you know, if I have to go through all this, I might as well be governor. I think along about that time, this is his first term as Attorney General. Along about that time, I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't say anything to me about it, about governor. I worked with him on the prison thing, but he never said anything to me about running for governor. What he did talk about from time to time was this government doesn't work. If the governor wants to do something, he has to check with about 100 people. You can't govern that way.
And when he decided to run in '68, assumedly the timing was right for him.
Yep.
And a big part, it seemed to me recollection was there were two big issues. One was pragmatically, we've got to get this government to run, which evidenced itself ultimately in executive reorganization. And the other thing was the pay more what for, the sales tax thing, which had risen in '67 in the legislature big time, and he took that on as the cause. And were those the two big things in the '68 race? You were involved in the campaign in 1968.
The reorganization was not a pillar in his government and in his political thing.
But it was in his mind.
It was in his mind, I'm sure. That was number one priority in his mind.
Yeah.
When he was talking about pay more what for, he was talking about politics. Winning the governorship. After it got to be governor, I think there was a pretty clear priority.
Well, when the election was held and he ran against Babcock, and Babcock was openly for the sales tax, and the Republican Party was, and this was the first evidence of the challenge of that sales tax politically for the Republicans, and they didn't make it. They pulled their horns in the '69 session and didn't bring up the sales tax again in '69, which left that as the playing field for him to put together that very carefully crafted executive reorganization combination.
I think so. I think so.
You know, I mean, he put the constitutional amendment on the ballot for the 1970 election. He got the bill in there to create the commission that he was chairman of. And as they started researching, I was part of that staff, wet behind the ears, doing the research.
A lot of young people on that staff.
Some really, really talented people were believing that government could make a difference in a positive way, and did that. But he was very strong about how crazy it was to try to make government work without something like that. What would be the value of even being a governor? He really wanted to govern, didn't he?
That's right. That's right. That's why he wanted reorganization. He wanted to govern.
You know.
He figured it out.
And
he had a lot of very able help.
Yeah, yeah. There were a lot of really good people were engaged in that effort, but we're also engaged in his overall administration. You started out in that administration as well, did you?
Yeah. I didn't make a very large contribution to that at all, but I worked with him on it.
You know, you keep saying that, and I appreciate that, but all I know is as a wet behind the ears young staffer. And when the 71 came, all I know is that we were advancing the reorganization after the election of 1970 when the people said 20's plenty would work. And I was doing this stuff. I was being mentored by people who knew a heck of a lot, and all I know is that people like you and Fred Barrett and Ron Richards would get behind some closed doors and come out with some very interesting decisions on behalf of Governor Anderson, working with him. And that was stuff I had no idea the level of sophistication that was going into the decision-making that was going on. I was learning every minute. And so when you say you didn't have such a role, I can tell you from my perspective, your role along with Fred, along with Ron, along with the governor himself, of course, in a big giant way, along with Duke Crowley, these were giants to me. So you were one of those giants. I
didn't feel like a giant, and from time to time, Forrest Anderson would say to me, "Bennett, go stand in the corner."
Now you mentioned that the governor was the real architect of the policies.
You bet.
That
he not only the architect, but to quite a degree, he was the implementer. But he relied on some very, very first-class people on planning, and organizing, and so on. He maybe you call it lucky, but I think it was shrewd. I think he was a very good choice of people. He had a wonderful bunch of people working for him. Maybe it was just the times, maybe it was the people that were there, but I always admired his selection of people. He knew people that could do things.
Well, he did. On the other hand, I would bring up that a future governor, Governor Schwinden, served in his almost the full 4 years with Governor Anderson, and served with Governor Judge for 4 years before becoming lieutenant governor. And Governor Schwinden, in his recollections to me, has said that he was sitting on the farm at Tule Creek up there by Wolf Point, within about 40 miles of your family farm, and he got a phone call from you that said, Governor Anderson wants to have you come down here and be the land commissioner. And tell us how that evolved, because I think you were doing a little northwest or northeast Montana stuff there, weren't you?
No, well, no. I'd watched Schwinden for quite a while, and mainly, I suppose, because he was a northeastern Montana guy. But my vague recollection is, not to be relied on very much, but it seems to me that we were talking one day about people that he was going to select, and I think he said he didn't know what the hell to do about the agriculture thing.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't know many farmers, and he said, "You're an old farm union guy. Who's that?" Something like that. Not intended to be terribly flattering, I guess. And I said, "I think you ought to get a farmer." And he said, "Well, who's the farmer?" And I said, "I think Ted Schwinden has made quite a record down there in the legislature as somebody that people can trust and rely on and so on. I think you can trust and rely on him." He said, "Okay, go call him up." I think that's the way it happened. I don't know.
Yeah.
I know that Schwinden wasn't lobbying for it at all. He wanted some time to talk to his wife about it and worried about it, and he finally came back, said he'd be interested in it.
I think he said in our discussions that you had called and you said, "Now don't take too," he said, "I have to talk it over with Gene and the family and figure this out." And you said, "Well, don't take too much time because Governor Anderson is rather impatient about these things." Is that likely to be?
That's likely to be what I said.
And he was not too patient about, once he just was looking to do something, he wanted it to happen, huh?
Yeah.
Now, when you think about it, he got reorganization done, and yet he wasn't the beneficiary of it in the long haul because of his being in one term. I think, but I think Alec Hansen, in his discussions with us, said that in the car with Forrest at one point, he said, "I may not be the guy that gets to take advantage of this executive reorganization, but it's for all the future governors of this state is what it's for."
That's right.
And I think he must have sensed that he was probably not feeling well at the time, and he ended up being a one-term governor. Can you give us some reflections on that a little bit?
I think now we're getting into the crystal ball thing, but I think his thinking went along these lines. At that time, the Anaconda Company was losing interest in running Montana.
Mm-hmm.
They, long about that time, they sold the Lee newspapers.
Sold them in '59,
they became independent.
Yeah.
Long about that time, the lobbyists were beginning to restrict themselves to strictly what affected the Anaconda Company, and I think mostly taxes is what they were interested in. But they weren't interested in running the state of Montana anymore.
Like they had for 75 years.
That's right.
Yeah.
And they pulled out. And Forrest saw that, I'm sure, just from conversations with him, about here is the opportunity for people to get a hold of the state government for the first time. And that, I think, was one of the reasons he was so strong about why he put such high priority on government consolidation.
It was a marvelously crafted structure that he put together. And we've talked about that in another program we did on this.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just really phenomenally well thought out. But the Anaconda Company clearly had kind of pulled back a little bit.
Quite a bit, I think.
Montana Power kind of wanted to assume the role a little bit more, but they were still playing a role when this was happening, and for him to see this change happening, I think was that's what this Crucible of Change is really about, is taking us away from the copper collar.
Mm-hmm. And it could be, you asked me a couple of questions ago when he started thinking about being governor. Whenever that was, I think he was also looking at when the Anaconda Company was going to be through governing.
Mm-hmm. The structure of government, the archaic, confused, diffused structure of the executive branch, where, as you said, you'd have to talk to 100 people to get something done, served the interest of the outside external powers.
Divide and conquer.
You know, if the government couldn't be strong and aggressive under a governor, then who's going to get in your way if you're in control from the outside? And I think, you know, we have talked a bit about things like most of the bills in the legislature were written by Anaconda Company attorneys.
Mm-hmm.
I remember Gene Tidball saying that when he became the head of the Legislative Council, he found there were 4 copies of every bill, and he knew where 3 of them went, and he couldn't figure out where the 4th one went, and he sent his staff to work finding him, and finally they came back and said, "No, we found out where the 4th copy of all the bills went." So where was that? It went to the Anaconda Company.
6th floor of the Hennessy building is where it went.
Yeah, isn't that kind of amazing? So he basically, we got one term. Would you just and we're about to run out of time, but health took over. As much as he would have liked to have been governor, he had some serious health problems that precluded that.
Very serious.
Yeah.
Very serious. Painful.
Yeah.
Painful.
So he ended up saying, "Okay, I'm one term, but I've done something big for future governors." Did he feel that?
I think he not only, I think, will clearly get full credit for government reorganization. I think also that he should get a good deal of credit that is going to be hard to qualify, and that is, behind the scenes he was working on the Constitution all the time. But he didn't want people to know that, because he agreed with Grable and some of the other people that came up with this brilliant idea of having the constitutional people sit alphabetically. Rather than by party. He thought if he got into the constitutional thing, it would make it partisan.
Well, good. He was very forward-looking.
He stayed out of it, but he was working all the time on the constitutional thing. I happen to know that because I had a relative on the Constitutional Convention. She said, "The governor seems to be very much interested in this."
No. Well, we're running out of time.
Yeah.
This has been a very fast hour and a fascinating hour, and your reflections are phenomenal. They're going to be a useful addition to our whole discussion of this period of time in the Crucible of Change. So, Judge Gordon Bennett, thank you very much for what you've done for Montana and your role in this series.
Thank you for the flattery. It was all my pleasure.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
And we'll be back next time.
Yep.